Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Chapter 7, Halacha 1. If you're following along in the art scroll, it's 51b4. Chapter 7 is going to cover some of the topics that you may have been wondering about all along. Things like, what do we do about Sheviis Sanctity? How does it work? Other questions, what about Beur? How does Beur work exactly? I know that we covered some of the highlights of Beur, but we didn't actually cover details in the halacha. What about that? What about other things like dyes? Are dyes going to have Sheviis sanctity? Or what about animal food? What about that? And that's kind of what we're going to be covering in Chapter 7. This is going to be a multi-part shiur. I believe it'll be 4 or 5 parts because of the length of Halacha 7. Most of the shiur today is going to cover this very, very, very long Mishnah. Normally a Mishnah will have 6 to 8 halachot in it. This will be very long for a Mishnah. Also, we will cover the first part of the sugya, first part of the Gemara, that actually is going to deal with the biblical quote and source for this. The Mishnah says that a major rule was stated regarding the applicability of the law of Sheviis. And here's what it is. It says this Mishnah, any product of the earth that is human food, animal food, or dye stuff, and does not endure in the ground, has Sheviis sanctity. So let's cover this. So as a general rule, we're talking about things that are covering Sheviis, and we're not talking about other years. And as a major rule, it's talking about a range of produce that's going to be subject to the Meiser requirement. And that, where it says kalal as a rule over there in Maestros 1.1, and the idea here is that in a normal time, this rule is going to apply with Meiser only for human food, okay? But there's a rule here that's being said for this kalal, which is going to be more encompassing. It's going to be different. And what that's going to do is it's going to say that the laws of Sheviis are going to apply to not only human food, but also to animal food and things with dyeing. Now, that's a big departure for how farm produce was normally treated. So we can see a difference between Maestros and here. You can see the difference in Maestros 1.1, and where it's saying this rule, it's only talking about food. This is a major thing because it's actually referring to more than just human food. Now, we're talking about things that do not endure in the ground. So we're talking about produce that if you leave it alone is not going to survive winter. It's also going to decompose. And the idea is that there will come a time when the animals who forage in the fields can't get at it anymore. So there are probably some kinds of things like you can imagine cucumbers that either the animals will eat the rest of it, or if they didn't eat the rest of it, it would just sort of rot in the ground and it would not survive a winter. There are going to be other products that will survive. We were covering that before, where we were talking about loof, and we were talking about with onions, so that, can you have loof that will survive for many years? Yes, you can. That's going to be coming up. So the Mishnah is going to continue, and basically it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. So one of the ideas is that for a Beur has to be in a case where it can be when it leaves the field, you have to take it out of your house. But then what happens if something doesn't leave the field? Like what we're saying. We're talking about something that does not endure in the ground. Well, what about something that does endure in the ground? And if something does endure in the ground, And that's not going to be subject to Sheviis because it never actually left the field. I can imagine that there would be some species of gourds that might survive through a winter and might actually not decompose in the ground and actually might be able to be picked at that later stage. So you could end up with a case where that particular type would not have a Beur. But anyway, this is going to have Sheviis sanctity. That means that when you're talking about things with dying, that's going to have Sheviis sanctity. Animal food is going to have Sheviis sanctity. Now, I want to talk about this. This is actually going to be a Doraita thing. This is actually going to be in Leviticus 25:6. And, again, we have this rule that Sheviis sanctity is going to apply to human food and animal food, and that's actually going to be a Doraita thing. And it says, the Shabbos produce of the land, in other words, this sanctified Sheviis produce, shall be for you to eat, and for your animal, and for the beast that is in your land, all its crop shall be to eat. In other words, this verse is actually saying about human food and animal food, and therefore, this is going to have a broader rule than just maestros. Now, regarding dyes, that's also going to have a scriptural source, but the Gemara is going to get into that later. So let's recover this Mishnah and expand on it. And so it says, a major rule was stated regarding the applicability of the laws of Sheviis, and any produce of the earth that is an animal food, a human food, an animal food, a dye stuff, and does not endure in the ground has Sheviis sanctity, and the money exchanged for it has Sheviis sanctity. It is subject to Beur, and the money exchanged for it is also subject to Beur. So the idea here, by the way, it puts it in a category in terms of importance. Human food is first. You're not allowed to waste human food. Then you have animal food, and then you have dye stuff in a descending order. However, they all have sanctity. Now, we were talking about what happens with Beur, okay? Because now we're talking about the parts about Beur. And the idea is that once it's no longer available in the field for the animals to go and forage, basically, if you have some in your house, you have to take it out. There's a debate whether it has to be destroyed or you leave it out to be hefker, or you also might be leaving it out for the animals themselves to go eat it. And the idea is that, like maestros, you can, or even Beurim, you can exchange the produce for money. And then that money is going to get sanctity. Now, the idea is that if you're going to take this product and you're going to exchange it for money, then now this money has the sanctity and the produce does not. And that means that just like the crops were subject to Beur, because it does not endure in the ground, this money basically is going to be treated the same way. So when this crop is no longer available in the field, you have to put out the money. It is subject to Beur. The money is subject to Beur. So the idea is that you would have to remove not only the produce, but also any of the money that comes through the sale of Sheviis produce of that type. And also, if you traded for some of the produce, you'd also have to leave that out. So let's say I had some cucumbers and I traded it to you for some squash. And now one of them or both of them, let's say the cucumbers have left the field well, you'd have to put out the squash, even if the squash was still available in the field, because how did you acquire it, right? You've acquired it with this money. That's also another problem with doing business with Sheviis produce. So let's say you're a Sheviis merchant, or you actually had some legitimate sales with something with Sheviis, and you have money from it now. Now, this product is no longer available in the field, Well, you have to take the money, you have to put it out. That's not normally what somebody with Sheviis produce will do. Normally a Sheviis merchant will keep the money and spend it. Let's say that Sheviis merchant spends the money and gives it to a third party. Well, that money still is going to be subject to Beur, and it's still going to be subject to Sheviis. It's still going to have Sheviis sanctity, and that's really another deeper insight on the problems with Sheviis merchants, because now with this crop that they've made money on, they're putting into circulation, even if they're buying something before Sheviis, they're putting into the circulation of the money supply something that has sanctity and something that actually is supposed to be destroyed, is not supposed to be used. So there's a lot of problems that come with people who do business with Sheviis, where they're going to really get a lot of poverty problems. And you could see why, because they're really putting into the money circulation coins that have kedusha in it. And not only that, when the original crop left the field, it's supposed to be put out. This money's supposed to be put out. Very deep insight into part of the nature of the problem with Sheviis produce sales. Now we're going to get into other products of Sheviis that are subject to Beur, and these are also going to be from these three categories: animal food, human food, animal food, and dyestuffs. And the Mishnah says, and which product of the earth is typical to be encompassed by this rule? And it says, among the human foods are the leaf of the wild loof. So if you look in Kalayim in chapter 1, it will cover the wild loof and the regular loof, and it will also cover endive, wild endive, and it treats it like two different species. And the idea here is that on the wild loof, it's not normally going to be food. You're not going to cultivate it, and it's going to have a different kind of characteristic. The leaves are going to be really bitter. By the way, just, in classic cooking, the leaves of the leeks are used, and they were used for a long time for making soups and stocks. They're very handy for that, and so I imagine that it would have been used back then as well. And so among the human foods are going to be the leaf of the wild loof. It's interesting because this Mishnah is going to put wild loof together with, these were leeks, by the way, together with the domesticated ones. And the reasons why the Mishnah is going to bring the wild variety is going to be where it's trying to contrast the leaf to the root, and then it's going to continue, and it's going to say the leaf of mint, endives, leeks. These are going to be the not the field variety. These are going to be the garden variety. But again, you could see more about that in the Mishnah in Kalayim 1:2. And the idea here is that this Mishnah is teaching that the wild variety is going to have Sheviis sanctity as human food. And it's going to continue. It's going to say portulaca, I don't know what that is, and milky blossom. Milky blossom, I'm not sure what that is. Portulaca and milky blossom, though, says the Rosh, were eaten mainly by animals, but they're also fit for human consumption with difficulty. And the Mishnah is teaching that since it could be, if necessary, eaten by humans, it will qualify as human food with regards to Sheviis, and so it has to have a greater degree of stringency that's going to come to human foods, because human foods can get tuma. And then the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, and among the animal foods are thorns and thistles, and among the dye stuff are aftergrowths of isatis. Isatis, by the way, is going to be woad. This is going to be, in the ancient world, the source for blue dye. Later on, in the 1800s, it becomes indigo. Indigo becomes the source for blue dye, but in the ancient world, it was going to be woad. And in fact, just a little bit of history. What's interesting is that in Britain, in ancient, Britannia, before the Romans conquered it and during the Roman conquest of it, and even after Hadrian's Wall, the Picts that were there, those were going to be the descendants of the Scots and the people that were in the English areas that were ultimately conquered by the Romans. The warriors there, they used to paint themselves blue with woad. They used to put lime into their hair with water to make it stand up and get stiff. And they used to dress partially naked and put all sorts of symbols on them with the woad to make themselves frightening. And the Roman records report that, in fact, they were very fierce and very scary. They were very frightening. And that was part of the idea. So safflower is also going to be put in there. Safflower is going to be a source for red dye. These are going to be for the dyes. Now, the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say all of these have Sheviis sanctity, and the money that's exchanged for them has Sheviis sanctity as well. And all of these are subject to Beur, and the money exchanged for them is subject to Beur. So this is trying to cut out leaves from roots. We're going to be getting into the roots later because the halachas are going to be different. Again, the species that are listed here, they're going to be animal food, they're going to be human food, they're going to be dyes. And the idea here, what's connecting it, is that these leaves are not going to survive the winter. And because it's not going to survive the winter, this is going to be subject to Beur. And if you had any money that got traded for them, this money is going to have Sheviis sanctity. So the Mishnah is going to continue with another rule. It's going to say, another rule was stated regarding the applicability of Sheviis law. Any product of the earth that is in the category of human food or animal food, or it is a dye stuff, and it endures in the ground. So now we're talking about the other category. We're talking about something that perhaps the leaves fell off, but now perhaps there's a bulb in the ground and the bulb doesn't die off. And the idea is that, during winter, it will survive it. And, it can be available even throughout the year for animals to go and forage it. In other words, if animals were to dig into the ground, they could find things. There are animals that do dig into the ground to look for food. The wild boar, by the way, is one of them. So just because you have a non-kosher animal that's going and looking for food, well, it's Hashem's creation, and it also fills the verse that it's supposed to be left for the animals. So could a wild boar go and look for onions or truffles? Yes, they can. So the idea is that it's going to survive the winter, and we're going to get into categories of these things that do survive the winter. And so this Mishnah continues. It says it endures in the ground, and it has Sheviis sanctity, and the money exchanged for it has Sheviis sanctity, but is not subject to Beur, nor is the money exchanged to it subject to Beur. So why is it that this money now is not subject to Beur? Well, because it didn't have a time where it was no longer available in the field. And in other words, that even after the winter, you could go dig up these wild onions or these wild loof, and you could go get it. And it never actually left the field. It was always there. And because of that, it's not going to be subject to Beur at all. And because it's not subject to Beur, then the money that's exchanged for it, while it does have Sheviis sanctity, because that produce has Sheviis sanctity, it's not going to be subject to Beur. And it's trying to pull apart these two things. Yes, you can have a case where something will have Sheviis sanctity, but no, it will not be subject to Beur. Yes, it can be subject to Beur if it will leave the field and decompose in the ground and no longer be available. But as we're going to see, there are a lot of cases of a lot of kinds of plants that are food things that will survive a winter, will endure through the winter, and will be available for you to pick anytime you want. So again, there will be a category of things that are not subject to Beur. Now the Mishnah is going to give an example of these plants that are not going to be subject to Beur, and which product of the earth is typical with this rule. And it says, among the human food and animal foods are the roots of the wild loof. This is going to be the wild leek that grows. The root of the mint, the arcavlin, the chalbetzim, and the bugaria. Okay, so what are these? This is going to be identified in the Bavli, in Eruvin 26b, and Rashi says that it's a grass that grows near the base of a palm and curls itself around it. And the Rambam calls it a scorpion plant because the leaves look like a scorpion, and the modern people call it a heliotrope. And the bugaria is coming from Arabic, and it's a plant that has a herb whose root has a cinnamon-like smell, and the chalbetzim is going to be covered coming up on exactly what the identity of that is. And the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, and among the dye stuffs, madder and resed luteola. So these are going to be available throughout the year. And the idea is that, like with the root of the wild loof, not the leaves will not survive the winter, but the root will, this bulb. And the idea is that, could people go out and collect these wild leeks? Yes, animals can too, and it's going to be in the ground throughout the year. In fact, it can be in the ground for many years. You actually can have leeks growing for many, many years. So the Gemara says that all these have Sheviis sanctity, and the money exchanged for them has Sheviis sanctity, but they are not subject to Beur, nor is the money exchanged for them subject to Beur. Why? Because these are, yes, they have Sheviis sanctity, but no, these are in the field, even up for many years, and because they're always available, and because they can survive for so long, and they don't die out and rot in the field that particular year, you can always just go get it. And because it never actually left the field, and it's always available, it's not subject to Beur. Now, there's going to be an opposing opinion, of course. And the Mishnah says that Rabbi Meir says, while these products themselves are not subject to Beur, the money exchanged for them is subject to Beur and must be consumed before Rosh Hashanah of the 8th year. So there's a disagreement only on this one thing about Beur. So in this case, like let's say with the leeks that last, Rabbi Manna is agreeing that yes, under biblical law, the money exchanged for the Sheviis produce is exempt from Beur, and the idea is that if it has sanctity though, and he's saying that it's going to be by a rabbinical decree, and the idea is that behind Rabbi Meir's thinking on this is that the reason that we have this rabbinic decree, according to Rabbi Meir, whereas the original Sheviis produce is always recognized and will be handled with Sheviis sanctity if you leave it indefinitely. If you have money that's being paid for it, it's not going to be distinguished from other money. And so he's putting on a stringency on that money, because you can't tell the difference between money that was exchanged for Sheviis produce and the actual produce itself. And so what he's adding this rabbinic rule that says, wait a second, because you can't distinguish between the money anymore, you have to use this money and get rid of it by Rosh Hashanah, before the 8th year. Otherwise, you're going to leave it in the money supply, and you're going to mess things up. And part of the problem is that if you just said that this money has Sheviis sanctity, but you don't have any Beur to it, then you're going to have an unlimited time to deal with this money, and you might unlawfully use it for commerce. You're not allowed to use money that has Sheviis sanctity for regular commerce. You can't go out and buy baby diapers with it. You can't go and buy a barbecue with it. You gotta use it differently. So because it's unlawful to use for regular commerce, they're trying to put on a precaution so that they're saying, Rabbi Meir's point is a d'Rabbanan thing, that we're going to make sure that this is still going to be subject to Beur. So the rabbis are going to reply, and they said to Rabbi Meir, these plants themselves are not subject to Beur, and how much more so the money exchanged for them. So they're not buying it. They're arguing that, I understand your point, and there might be a basis for a rabbinical decree, but the problem is that since you have Sheviis produce itself that's not Beur, then the money exchanged for it can still not be subject to Beur. So that's going to be the idea. We're going to see Rabbi Meir's response to this argument later on in this Gemara coming up, and the Mishnah is going to continue. It's going to say, until this point, the Mishnah has provided examples of these secondary plant components that have Sheviis sanctity. We were talking about the leaves, and we were talking about the roots. Again, it's split up into two different things. You can have the same plant, like this leek, and you could have it where the leek will have one part which will have the bulb, and it will not be subject to Beur. And you can have the other part that has a different halachic status, like the leaves, and that will be subject to Beur. So very important to understand that when you're thinking about these plants, you don't think of it as a big monolith. Oh, it's just leeks and that's that. No, it gets split up. And so until this point, we were looking at these like secondary components with the leaves and the roots or the bulbs. And now we're going to look at these other components for fruit. And keep in mind, we were talking about dyes. These are going to be basically components that are used for dyes. So the Mishnah says the rind of pomegranate and its blossom. By the way, that's still going to be used to make a reddish dye, even to today. A husk of walnut. Now, I want to point this out. We're talking about when you open up the shell of the walnut, there's going to be three parts. There's going to be the nut itself, okay, that you're going to eat. Now, you're going to have this other like brownish thing inside that's going to be the husk. That's what we're going to use for dye. And the shell itself is going to be considered worthless. It has no use. So the shell itself is treated like wood. You just throw it away. It's not used for dye and it's not eaten. That has no sanctity. But the husk does. And the husk is going to be treated differently than the nut, because that's going to be used for dye. Also pits. So we're talking about usable fruit pits. What could you use these fruit pits for? Well, let's say you take dates. What do they do with dates? Well, these will have Sheviis sanctity, first of all, and you can feed these to goats. Goats will eat anything. So it can be used as a foodstuff for animal. And even if you have harder pits that can't be used, like an olive pit, the Rambam talks about this in Hilchos Shmita V'Yovel 7:14, that even if it's going to be used as firewood, which they did use the pits as firewood, this use does not bestow Sheviis sanctity on the product. Since the pits are components of edible fruit, they're going to be classified as fruits, which has Sheviis sanctity. So, because according to the Rambam, the pit of the olive, which might be very hard to eat, it's still going to have Sheviis sanctity because it was a part of the olive, and the olive is edible. Okay, so the pits have Sheviis sanctity, and the money exchanged for them also has Sheviis sanctity. So let's say you have olive pits, even if you're not using it to feed to the animals because it's too hard for your animals to eat it. Although the date pits are much softer and more easily, goats could do something with it. It's still going to have Sheviis sanctity because, as the Rambam points out, it was part of a fruit that has Sheviis sanctity. So if you exchange it for money, it's going to have Sheviis sanctity. So yes, dyeing is going to be a legitimate use for Sheviis and Sheviis produce. And, the plants can have many parts. Some of the parts of the plant might be edible, and some might be used for actually just for dyeing. And, there's a lot of records about the pomegranate rinds being used for dyeing in the ancient world. So this is not a weird abstract use. This was a normal use that in a pre-industrial age was done. The Mishnah now is going to talk about a different law regarding Sheviis, and it says a dyer, somebody who's going to be dyeing, perhaps using these pomegranates themselves, these rinds, may use Sheviis produce to dye for himself. So the idea is that you're allowed to dye, and the idea is that you can even use Sheviis produce to dye, and you can even use edible Sheviis produce, and that may be used to dye. That's what this is trying to express. And so this dyer might use or can use Sheviis produce to dye for himself, but he may not dye for payment. So while dyeing in general is going to be a legitimate Sheviis use, and it's going to be allowed, if you're doing it for money, well, now that's going to be like Sheviis produce and doing business with Sheviis produce, and that's not allowed. So there would be no different if you took leeks to the shuk that are Sheviis leeks and tried to sell them and be a Sheviis merchant, and there's no difference if you're a dyer who's now taking these pomegranate rinds and going and trying to make them into dyes and go and try to do business with it. Well, now you're a Sheviis merchant. Yeah, you're not doing Sheviis produce with, the vegetable itself in terms of selling it at the market, but you're taking something that does have Sheviis sanctity and you're doing business with it. In this case, you're doing dyes with it. So the idea is that you're not allowed to do business with Sheviis produce. And the Mishnah is going to continue, and it's going to say, one may not do a business with Sheviis produce, nor with bechorot, nor with truma, nor with nevelot, nor with trephos, nor with abominable creatures, nor with creeping creatures. In other words, that there are restrictions. And the idea is that, we're talking about like the firstborn animals, and, the Torah has a requirement for it. You're supposed to take this bechor, which is going to be something that has kedusha, and you're supposed to give it to the Goan, and it's going to, it's going to have something that's going to, tie into all the laws of kodeshim. So, the idea is that there's a restriction on doing business with bechorot. That's going to be rabbinic though and limited, because if it has a blemish, you're not allowed to put an offering onto it. And so, if it does get a blemish, it gets disqualified, can't be offered, but you could still slaughter it outside the temple, and you could eat it as chulin. So a Goan who owns a blemished Bechor is allowed to sell it to another Goan, or an Israelite, by the way. But the rabbis made a restriction on dealing in Bechorot, which means buying and selling them for profit. And the idea is that they wanted to make sure that it would stop people from cheating and violating, and doing things where they're going to delay and try to get the wool out of it. In other words, they're going to say, "Oh yeah, I bought this. Oh yeah, I'm going to eat it. Yeah, and you wait 3 years and you get 3 years of wool. So that's what they were trying to cut off. And with regards to truma, there's also going to be a rabbinical prohibition with non-Kohanim dealing with buying and selling of truma, because they might come to eat it, says the Rosh. And abominable creatures and creeping creatures, all of these are going to be forbidden under biblical law. And the Nevila is going to include any animal or bird that died in some other way other than shlita. Birds, by the way, have a different status in the halacha for transmitting tuma, so that the bird transmits tuma when it actually goes in your throat. Anyway, the Mishnah is going to elaborate on the prohibition against doing business with Sheviis produce. And now we're going to really understand what is a Sheviis merchant and what is not a Sheviis merchant. So the Mishnah says that one should not take vegetables of the field and sell them in the market, but he may pick the vegetables and have his son sell them in his stead. Okay, what does that mean? So vegetables of the field, these are going to be cultivated ones, and also not cultivated by humans, so it could be some wild loof. And the reason that the Mishnah is talking about vegetables of the field is because they are actually permitted for consumption. Now, vegetable species that are generally cultivated are rabbinically forbidden for consumption during Sheviis, even if they grew by themselves under the laws of Sefachim. So the Mishnah's ruling is saying that if you came and you picked and sold these vegetables, and this is going to be for consumption, it's going to apply to vegetables of the field. And that's the idea. So the terms to take and to pick, basically what this is saying is that the Mishnah is saying like this: you cannot pick vegetables and sell them in the market himself, but he's allowed to pick the vegetables and have his son sell them. And when somebody picks and sells the produce himself, he's performing the entire act of doing business, which entails an acquiring of the product. In other words, there's a lifting of the product. You're lifting it out of the ground, so you've acquired it, you've made a kinyan, and then he's selling it, so he's done all of it. And this is going to be prohibited. But where one person picks and another person sells, neither of them has done the business, because they're only doing one part of the operation, and that's going to be permitted according to the Tosafot in Sukkah 39a, and the Rosh and the Rosh. And the Mishnah is trying to use the example of the son to highlight that if the son sells the Sheviis produce on behalf of the father, it's not going to be like the father himself selling it. So the worry is about somebody doing the entire operation. And another way to look at this, says the Chazan Ish, is that even though the son is doing it with the father's permission, it's going to be permitted because using an intermediary to sell the produce that one picked is not a normative way of doing business. In other words, this is a back of the hand way to do it. Normally you pick the vegetables yourself and you go to the market and you sell it. You don't give it to an intermediary to sell, even if that intermediary is your son. The idea by the Chazan Ish is that it's a deviation from the normal way to conduct business at this day. So the idea is that he's permitted to sell it because, this is going to get into a definition of what is business, right? So the Mishnah is going to continue and we're going to get into this Gemara and cover the first part of the Gemara. The Mishnah is going to set down these parallel rulings relating to the prohibitions of doing business with bechorot and prohibited food items. And it says if one bought a blemished bechor for his son's wedding feast or festival, and in the end he did not need it, he is permitted to sell it. Well, the question is that, he originally did purchase this for personal use, and it was not really purchased for doing business. It wasn't purchased for a resale. And the idea is that, if he doesn't need it, he's not really doing business with it. And so the idea here is that, business, can be something where, it's being done for profit. Now, the idea here is that when he's selling this, the Rosh and the Rav and the Tosefta, Rav and Tosefta 5.8 and the Rosh's commentary, it's basically that the buyer may sell the Bechor for no more than the price he paid. In other words, he's not allowed to profit. He can't mark it up and sell it for profit. So that's going to be the idea. So let's say he didn't, he bought it and he didn't need it. Well, he can resell it again because he didn't need it and just not take a profit on it. And also that's not really doing business with it because that's not a normal way of dealing with merchandise. So trappers of wild animals, fowl, or fish who, while hunting for kosher species, chanced upon non-kosher species are permitted to sell them. The idea is that there's a prohibition on dealing with non-kosher species, and you're not allowed to hunt for them. But if you ended up, setting a trap and you caught a non-kosher species in it, you were trying to catch a kosher one, but you caught a non-kosher one, you're allowed to sell it. And the Rambam echoes that in Hilchos Machalos Asuros. And the idea is that even if the trapper, happened upon this non-kosher creature, and the idea is that perhaps even if he's not actually he's like a hunter, right? Is he allowed to actually shoot the bow and arrow to catch it or seize it or something? He is. So what's going to be the difference with doing business with Nevilos? That's going to be dealing where you're actually that's actually your business is in trade with acquiring at a lower price, selling at a higher price, and that there's a markup on it or something like that. So if you have a merchant a trapper who is dealing with kosher produce and he happens to catch a non-kosher thing like a boar, is he allowed to go and sell it to the idol worshippers? As long as the idol worshippers are going to just use it for food and not any kind of avodah, then he can do it. Because again, that's not his normal trade. That's why it's going to be allowed. It's not a normal set of merchandise. It's not a normal trade. Rabbi Yehuda says in this Mishnah, even one who chanced upon a non-kosher creature while going on his way may take them and sell them, provided this does not become his occupation, but the sages forbid it. So the idea here is that, Rabbi Yehuda is saying if you're going on your way and you find, non-kosher animals, perhaps like birds, the idea is you're more like a professional hunter than a trapper. The idea is that you're allowed to take it and sell it. But again, as long as it's not your business, as long as it's just like a one-off thing. But the sages are saying, no, you still can't do it. And they're extending it over and saying that, this is the Tanna Kama saying no. And they're basically saying that, the Tanna Kama is only allowing you the non-kosher creatures that they chance upon that, happened in a non-deliberate way. And they're worried about, if you captured it in a deliberate way, and it might actually trigger licensing fees. That's going to be part of the issues with trapping. There was fees that the government used to put onto people. So you might end up changing how the licensing fees worked. So we'll get more into that and explain it in the Gemaras coming up. The first Gemara is going to give the source for this, and it's beautiful and interesting. So the Mishnah taught that human food, animal food, dye stuffs have Sheviis sanctity. Now the source of this rule is going to be for human and animal food is going to be in Leviticus 25, 6 and 7. It's going to say, the Sabbath of the land shall be for you to eat, and for your animal, and all its crop shall be to eat. And the source of the law with respect to dye stuff is less obvious. So it wants to know, what is the source for the dyes? And so the Gemara says, regarding dye stuff used for humans, what is the source of the law that has Sheviis sanctity? In other words, where do you know that dyes in the Torah has this? From where are you getting this? And that's how the Vilna Goan mends the text. He says, regarding dye stuff used for humans, from where is it derived that they have Sheviis sanctity? And that's a clearer way to answer it. Gemara is going to answer it. It's going to say, let us derive it from the following verse. It's going to be 25:6. That's going to be basically, by the way, the same as for the derivation of the animals and the people. So Gemara answers, it says, let us derive it from the following verse. In Leviticus 25:6, it says, the Sabbath produce of the land shall be for you to eat. And the Gemara says that for you implies the Sabbath produce may be used for any purpose that is necessary for you. In other words, common human necessary, or commonly necessary for a person. And the Gemara continues, it says, it was taught in a brisa regarding this exposition that this encompasses needs such as eating, drinking, anointing, and dyeing, which are necessities common to all people. And excluded, however, is using Sheviis produce to make a medicinal plaster, which is only used for the sick. And excluded is using Sheviis produce to make a linten, which is useful only for those who have no sense of taste. And we see here that it is derived from the verse, for you, that Sheviis produce may be used for dyeing, and that the plants cultivated as dye stuff have Sheviis sanctity. In other words, what this is saying is that they're saying that for you means that it's a general category. It's not going to be just for sick people. It's not going to be just for people who have limited ability to, say, taste. It's going to be for everybody. And so it's not going to be just for one use, like medicines. And that's going to be, a really novel way to read this. And the Gemara is going to challenge it. But we are going to cover that in depth tomorrow. So have a great day, and we'll do part 2 tomorrow.